I have somebody that you absolutely need to meet, and he is a former police officer turned educator. He's got a PhD. He's from a law enforcement family, and he decided to write a book that explains a lot of the truths about the criminal justice system in America today, especially when it comes to law enforcement. Will Moravits, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So your book is called The Blue Divide, Policing and Race in America. So that's a pretty loaded title, and I want to get into that. But first, I want people to know that you come from a law enforcement family, and you became a police officer for a couple of years until life took over. Talk about that for just a second.
Yeah. So, growing up, I had great respect for police. I never really thought about, becoming a police officer until 9/11. I was had just turned 23. I was my first job out of college. And I felt like I really needed to give back to the community. I was born with some hearing loss in my right ear, so I knew the military wasn't going to accept me. So I thought, well, police is where I should probably go. And so that's how I ended up a police officer. Unfortunately, family issues with small children pulled me away from that. As happens with a lot of officers, family life can be troubling. And so I've just been in education ever since, and political science has been my forte. And, and following, a lot of these high profile cases where police have had to shoot and kill Black people, or, in the case of George Floyd, dying under police use of force, just the narrative around it over the past 8 or 9 years just really frustrated me, because it was evident that people in the media don't have a clue about the use of force continuum. They don't have a clue about what the law says, all sorts of different things. And after the summer of 2020, with all the riots and with such negative criticism defunding the police, all that, I said, I've got to write something to hopefully make a difference, specifically with the people that don't like police. They're my target audience, but people that do support police, I think this book will give them a lot of ammunition, pardon the pun, to combat that false narrative.
So I want to go back to where a lot of this started, and you bring this up in the book. Really, this all kind of came to light for the modern generations with the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, didn't it?
Yeah, he was not the first Black victim or, of police shootings that I talk about. The first one that actually, I did them all chronologically. So Eric Garner was the first one. And of course, that one that was like, I Can't Breathe Part 1, and you read the autopsy report and realize he had a heart condition. He was severely obese, and it's just, the narrative was pretty bad.
Yeah. Eric Garner wasn't
but there was
shot.
a lot
he died in police custody.
He was briefly put into what in jiu-jitsu you would call an arm triangle, and then it was released within 5 seconds. So that one caused some issues, but the real big one was Michael Brown, the summer of 2014, because this is where you got the hands up, don't shoot. His friend Dorian Johnson that was with him was after the shooting, and he's like, oh, he had his hands up, don't shoot. And and so you had NBA players, NFL players, there was a MSNBC newscast. They all put their hands up, and you just kind of ran with that narrative. And when the facts came out, it was evident. 3 different organizations, including the Department of Justice under Obama, investigated the shooting and said, no, this is legally justified. It was on the up and up. And, as it turns out, many Black witnesses verified Officer Wilson's testimony about what happened. And those that said he had his hands up, don't shoot, or whatever, they found that their testimony or their statements continued to change. And as often happens when you are lying, is that your story changes. And so that, I watched a lot of coverage of that. I remember on CNN, Marcus Lamont Hill had commented under a picture of an officer with I can't remember if it was an orange shotgun or a pink shotgun. I think it was orange, I was saying, oh, he's pointing it at people he's threatening to kill them. And I'm like, no, that's a beanbag shotgun. That's why it's an odd color, and it just things like that. And it continued on, throughout several other deaths. And then with the 2020 with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, the negative rhetoric got to a point where it was putting officers' lives in jeopardy. It was destroying, businesses. And I just felt like that we need to stop that. We need to stand up and put the truth out there.
I'm so glad you did. And I think people are really going to enjoy this book. In one of your chapters, you talk about the shooting of Tamir Rice, who,
Yes.
Again, when you look at that case, this is a young boy. Again, if you read the media narrative, he's just out playing in the park. The police pull up and shoot him.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit more about the facts of that case based on your research and how people can view that case differently? Because his death is a terrible tragedy.
Right.
There's more to the story.
Some people may disagree with me, but I'm a Catholic, and I believe that all human life is valuable. And so I think it's tragic that any of these people died, regardless if they legally deserve, was justified or not. But Tamir Rice, so he was out with a toy gun, and that many toy guns look very realistic these days, especially if you take that little orange cap off the end. And someone called in 911 and said there's a kid, a young black male out here pointing a gun at people. And the caller told the dispatcher that it's probably a fake gun. It's probably a toy. Dispatcher never tells that to the officers, right? Which is a mistake. And we're all human. We all make mistakes, but that was a big piece of information. So the officers, what they know when they arrive on scene is that there's a young black male with a gun pointing it at people. That's all they know. And they show up and they see 12-year-old Tamir Rice with the gun in his hand. And, within a matter of seconds, he's shot. Well, a couple of things about that particular case that bother me. One, about the narrative. I go into this in my book, and I know you're aware of the action is faster than reaction principle. And people often say, well, he didn't have the gun pointed at the officer. Well, with the OODA loop and all those different things, I explained that you can't just sit there. It's not like on TV when they got guns pointed at each other and then they start talking and try to have a conversation with them. The officers are there. They have to protect themselves, and they have to protect the people around them. They think that they think are in danger. So it was very tragic. The other thing about this too, this particular case, is the officer that shot Tamir Rice apparently had been dismissed from a previous police department, and there was not adequate communication between them, because apparently, he was not really mentally the right fit to be a police officer. As you know, the vast majority of Americans do not have the mentality to be a cop. So so many cops are ex-military, or, they just very disciplined, people. And so those two things really, really bother me. It's very tragic. And I don't, in my book, I don't defend every police action, right? Sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes departments hire the wrong person. Sometimes people just, make mistakes.
Mhm.
Like I tell people all the time, Tom Brady is arguably the greatest quarterback of all time. I think he is. No one probably studies harder than him and has more experience, but does he still throw interceptions? Yeah. But when he makes a mistake, it's an interception. He comes back the next drive, no big foul, right? When a cop makes a mistake, someone gets hurt, maybe someone dies. And that's a serious thing. And that really weighs on police officers. None of the officers that take a life feel good about it. I have a good friend that's a sergeant with SAPD, San Antonio Police Department, and he had to take a life on a domestic call. And he said for 3 weeks, every time he closed his eyes, he could see it, and it was a totally justified shoot. It's just, but people don't look at it that way. And that was, it seems like every chapter that I discuss one of these police killings, it's the same old thing. People just don't understand, what's going on and how the law and how the training operates. So hopefully after reading this book, they'll have a better understanding of that.
And I think that's what makes you unique. You, went to a police academy, worked in law enforcement for a couple of years, but then you got out, you went into academia, you got your PhD, and now you work in education. So you're not, people can't look at you and go, oh, this guy's just some cop who's a cheerleader for law enforcement.
Right.
No, you are so much more than that. So some of the other cases you talk about in a pre George Floyd era, one of the other ones was down in Texas, and that was Sandra Bland. And again, that's a case that is you just hear absolute falsities in the media all the time. She was not killed by the police. She actually committed suicide.
Right.
But what people have seen is, and she apparently had some mental health issues, and a Texas DPS trooper was terribly rude with her. I mean, there's no getting around that.
Yeah, I mean, and it's unfortunate, when you deal with people that have mental issues, unless you've had prior experience with that individual, you don't know, what their backstory is. What you can only make decisions off of the information that you're presented with. And as far as being rude, I mean, the way I was trained was that you mirror the attitude of the person you're dealing with. You start off polite, professional, but if you need to, start using some foul language and get stern, you need to do that. But yeah, she committed suicide in jail. And, there was a Sandra Bland Act that was passed in Texas to kind of help corrections officers recognize the signs and do better. But that was definitely not something that was the fault of the trooper by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, although he got fired anyway for,
well, you get fired sometimes because you're just trying to save face,
right.
I wouldn't want to be, the chief of police and have to make some of these decisions. But, that happens sometimes, the officers and deputies that are lucky enough to have a chief that has their back. They're really blessed. My chief was 25 years in Austin PD and then 11 years as chief in San Marcos. Incidentally, he's also a PhD criminal justice, and he's a professor at Texas State. And we actually had lunch recently, kind of catching up after all these years. And he was always that same way too. He's like, you do what you're supposed to do and I will have your back, but unfortunately in a lot of places you're politicians almost, and that you can use officers as a scapegoat, which is unfortunate.
Well, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, you're a political science professor. Policing has been so extraordinarily politicized, especially in the last couple of years, but again, really in the last 10 years. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, let's be clear. The history of policing with Black America is wrought with injustice. When you go back in history, I mean, no one's going to sit here and say that police did not mistreat Blacks in Mississippi circa 1950. But since the community policing era in the early 1990s, I believe that, things have changed. But I think what's really driving the attention nowadays is this overall academic viewpoint of critical race theory and how it's now filtering its way into every aspect of society. Had a former student that was an OCS for the Marine Corps, and he was told you got to use proper pronouns for people and all this kind of very politically correct. I don't know what Sergeant Lee Army would have said, about that kind of stuff. But, I think this idea of looking at everything through the lens of race is what's been starting to cause a lot of the problem. And the other aspect of that is, I have a whole chapter in my book where I talk about white men that were killed in almost the exact same situation as some of these Black people. And the media never doesn't talk about it because it doesn't sell. No one cares when a cop kills a white man. They care especially if it's a white cop and a Black man or a Black woman. And so that just gives you the perception that cops are hunting, as LeBron says, hunting Black people, and it's very unfortunate, but I think it's an overall trend in society just to look at everything through the lens of race and intersectionality. And I think that divides us more than anything. And it leaves people with, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, let's talk a minute about that great police tactical expert, LeBron James. After, this is after George Floyd and all that, the Ma'Khia Bryant police shooting, that is a chapter in your book. And I think it, because the vitriol immediately following that case, where none of the facts were known, it had an extraordinary impact on law enforcement, certainly on that police officer who had to shoot her. Talk about that case for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, so the incident happens right around the time the Darren Chauvin verdict comes down. It was like within a couple hours, I think. And LeBron James put on his Twitter a picture of Officer Reardon, who was the young, I think, forget how young he was, but he's in early 20s officer, on his Twitter, which he has tens of millions of followers, and he says, "You're next." Now, you can look at that one of two ways. A lot of people looked at it as he's saying, "You're next to die because you just shot and killed Ma'Khia Bryant." Some people said, "Well, you're next to be convicted and sent to prison." LeBron tried to backtrack later and say, I deleted it because people were getting the wrong impression. But again, it's an example of the media or a celebrity who has, way too much influence speaking before they have any of the facts. The reality is Officer Reardon shows up for a domestic dispute between some girls that were part of the foster care, program with the lady that lived at this house. And when the officer arrives, people say, well, Ma'Khia Bryant was the one that called in. Well, when officer arrives, Ma'Khia Bryant's got a knife in her hand and she's chasing a girl saying, "I'm going to fucking stab you." Pardon my French, but that's what she said. And there's another male that kicks the girl. She falls down. And then Bryant turns her attention to another Black female up against a car and is in the process of about to stab her when she gets shot. And I'm sorry, does the Black life of the girl she was trying to murder not matter?
Doctor, we keep hearing about that the American justice system is systemically racist. What is the reality of that? Because I know you write about that in your book.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, historically, yes, there was some systemic racism in our criminal justice system. I mean, and I think through the courts and through different laws that have passed over the past 100 years now, we've really sought to rectify those injustices. But when you look at the data from the last 3, maybe 4 decades, you find that there's one of the claims that's often suggested is that, Blacks get harsher sentences than whites for the same crime. Now, what you have to look at, in those situations, like Heather McDonald points out, criminologist dating back to the 90s, saying, it's not different sentences for the same crime. You also have to take in consideration, okay, person A has had a history of aggravated assaults, and now we're going to put him in prison, and the other person is their first rodeo, and we're going to put him in prison for a less lengthy time. The other thing that people have to understand is plea bargaining, right? If I commit simple assault and then the guy next to me commits aggravated assault but pleads down to assault, he's probably going to get a longer sentence than me because the actual crime was worse. So people have to look beyond just, what's the average amount of sentencing for a Black individual committing a felony and a white individual. They have to look at what felony was committed. Was there a plea bargain? What's the criminal history of the person, being sentenced? And when you do all that, you realize that there is negligible difference between how whites and Blacks are treated. And people will use anecdotal evidence all day long, which if you do any kind of research, the anecdotal evidence, is bunk. But for every white person that gets sentenced, or less harshly than a Black person, you can find where a judge sentenced a Black person less harshly than a white person. There was cases in San Antonio a couple years ago but I point to the trial of the 3 white men who killed Ahmaud Arbery. You're talking about Georgia, right? The deep South. 11 of the 12 jurors were white, and all 3 of them were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. So if that doesn't show you that we've come a long way, I don't know what is going to convince you, but the data's out there that at least since the 90s, the criminal justice system has not treated blacks and whites differently.
Doctor, where can people find you? Where can they find the book?
Well, the book is already on Amazon for pre-order, but it comes out February 15th. It's available Kindle, paperback, hardback. It'll be available Barnes & Noble and some other major retailers. You can find me on Twitter at W Moravits, M-O-R-A-V as in Victor, I-T-S, and then the number 23. Give me a follow. I don't do a whole lot of personal stuff on there. It's mostly politics and different things. But that's where a reader can reach out to me for more questions, more information, or for whatever reason they might need. But I did want to say one last statistic, because I think this is important. I pulled it up here because I thought maybe you might bring it up, but in 2015, the chances of a black person, male or female, being killed in a police contact by any means was 0.0000128%. I mean, you're talking astronomically low, but yet people think it happens every day, like all the time. Right. I just want to leave the listener with that tidbit of information, and there's much more in the book.
Fantastic. Doctor, thank you so much for spending time with us today. And if you would like more information about the National Police Association, visit us at nationalpolice.org.
Ma'am, put the gun down! Put the gun down!
Last year, law enforcement officers were involved in hundreds of thousands of use of force incidents. A use of force incident is when an officer must use nonverbal tactics to gain control of a dangerous situation.
Put the knife on the ground.
In many cases, officers have no choice but to use force when a suspect doesn't comply with a lawful order.
Use of force is always ugly. No one likes it, especially police officers.
Together, we can help de-escalate these dangerous encounters. Help police officers by complying with their lawful orders. Don't attack, attempt to disarm, or flee from an officer.
Use of force is an officer's last option. Most incidents can be avoided by not resisting arrest.
If you feel you've been wrongfully detained by a police officer, then seek a legal solution after the encounter has been resolved.
Let's keep everyone safe. Comply now and complain later.